Hi everyone, you're listening to The Art of Space-Time. I'm your host, Andy. I'm an astrologer and a writer. You can learn more about me and my work on my website, mysticsandwich.com. Enjoy the show. Hello. Thank you everyone for being here. I want to talk today about the idea of manifestation. I think this is the perfect example of something that we often see talked about in a superficial way, and it can be very easy to write off the whole idea. So this goes back to what I was talking about in episode 0, how within spirituality there are a lot of different ideas where, because we're often first shown kind of more superficial examples, it's very common or tempting to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's a risk in doing that because we risk losing out on really potent, empowering, important ideas. And I think this is one. So first, a lot of the ways that manifestation is talked about are not just superficial, but misleading or even flat out wrong. A lot of it, like a lot of ideas within spirituality, within the New Age, or even within culture at large, tend towards a neoliberal, individualistic, capitalist frame. And of course they would, right? Because that's the world we're living in. So there are a lot of forces pushing our thinking and our ideas and our work into that structure. And so it's important to analyze the ideas themselves, right? To see, is it like necessarily individualistic, or is that just the force of capitalism and neoliberalism operating on an idea that has a more substantial basis? So I say this in part because I've seen a few criticisms kind of like within the mainstream about the New Age that criticize the New Age for being like a, neoliberal project, basically. And I just think that kind of misses the point. Like, our culture is neoliberal, so ideas within it are going to be bent in that direction. And again, I'm not attached to the terminology New Age. Like, as I said in, I think it was episode 0, I haven't really decided if I want to draw a wider net and include more under the New Age, or whether I too, like many people, want to distance myself from it. So, I'm not attached to the label New Age. I just want us to think critically, basically. So, manifestation. The most popular versions instill this mindset that any of us can have whatever we want if we just put our minds to it. If we just think in the right ways, right? Visualize enough, make enough vision boards, we can manifest whatever we want. And usually the examples are, like a bigger home, fancy cars, the job you want, the partner you want, etc., etc. And there's almost never an acknowledgement of economic realities and economic injustice within these conversations. So often the sort of popular versions of manifestation discourse, we could say, perhaps unconsciously tend to take a rather right-leaning stance in claiming that anyone can have whatever they want if they XYZ. that what we create in our lives is solely due to our thinking, our visualizing, our mind, and has nothing to do with material conditions, right? To where we were born, who we were born to, what opportunities we have, what our challenges are. But equally, a perspective that is solely political and material and negates the spiritual is equally uncritically minded, is equally lacking in nuance, and is actually disempowering, right? So usually a politics that acknowledges economic injustice presents itself as empowering and compassionate. And there's an element of that. But if that's the only perspective we hold, it can end up being disempowering because it implies that the only possibility for some people in certain conditions to thrive is via massive social and political change, that there is absolutely nothing they can do to change their situation. And you'll notice that almost all my positions take a similar structure, right? Which is that the truth is rarely one extreme or the other. It's usually messy and more nuanced. And economic injustice is true, but it is also true that our own mindset and actions and intentions and perspectives and work and like so many things that we do have control over also impact our situation, right? Both are true. It feels important to acknowledge here, as I know many of you already know, that the economic system is rigged, right? It's meant to keep people caught in this wheel of overwork, underpay, in debt, and essentially at the whim of corporate power, really, right? Like the most wealthy need a labor force. And because of the structure of capitalism, which demands the highest profit, there's massive incentive to underpay people. And I'm not just like outright in a simple way anti-capitalist. Like I want to talk about that perhaps in a future episode because again, I believe that's a conversation that's more nuanced than we tend to make it. But I hope we can agree that there are some elements of the current economic structure, the current structure of capitalism that are super effed up. Namely, the requirement for infinite growth, right? And in our current economic model, there's a requirement for infinite growth, for increased profits, for expansion. And infinite growth is the very definition of unsustainable. Like, no wonder we have a climate crisis, right? If our world economic system requires infinite growth, increased profits, there's a requirement for more extraction, more exploitation. There's incentives towards unsustainability. And the requirement to prioritize profit at any cost is also deeply effed up, right? There's incentive towards exploitation. Personally, I really believe in the possibilities inherent in small business, in self-employment, in medium-sized business. There are aspects of capitalism that I think hold a lot of potential, promise, possibility opportunity and empowerment. But the current model is not conducive to small or medium-sized business. It's conducive to massive corporations. And now as we move more and more fully into a world order that is structured according to public-private partnerships, our governments are becoming more and more tied to corporate interest. So this is a little bit of an aside, right? I am going to get back to manifestation, but it feels important to take a little bit of time to explore the political context of these conversations and to maybe give you just a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from. So personally, I think it's inexcusable that we have not found a way to take care of our neighbors. Look at all the things that humans are capable of. I mean, we can go to outer space, and yet there are homeless people on the streets. Isn't that crazy? That's just crazy to me that we haven't found a way to just take care of each other in the most basic ways. And so personally, I think that everybody should be given basic needs. Like, no one should be without a home, without food to eat, without basic health care. And when people object to that and say, like, who's going to fund it? I mean, look at the enormous corporate profits. Look at all the money going to war. Look at the billionaires and their stupid yachts. Like, money isn't the issue. It's an unjust system. And so I think one of the reasons these conversations can become controversial is because usually it's like the working class pitted against the middle class. Usually funding for public services, for example, is taken from the middle class, from people who are working their asses off to pay their rent. And it's a story as old as time, right? Divide and conquer. Keep us fighting amongst ourselves, and we won't even notice that we're all being controlled, essentially. If the 99.9% of us could see beyond our differences to all that we have in common, we'd be unstoppable. We'd be so powerful. And some of those differences matter, of course, but a lot of it is very convenient. A lot of it is, we're invited to hate each other. We're invited into these fights a lot of the time. I think it's entirely possible to create a system in which everyone is provided for and there are opportunities to business, entrepreneurship, to create, to innovate. This idea that those two things, right, we could say capitalism and communism, are counter to each other and opposed, and we have to choose one, is just another example of binary thinking. And I believe part of this transition in consciousness and paradigm is to move out of binary thought structures. Isn't it convenient that we've been led to believe that we have to pick one extreme or the other? Either you're capitalist or you're communist, and then the other side is your enemy. And I recognize that for a lot of people it is more nuanced. But like in the collective consciousness, we could say it's quite binary. So there's a lot more we could say about these things. And maybe I'll come back to this another day. But I wanted to touch a little bit on the political and economic context that matters when we're talking about something like manifestation. The thing about a purely communist perspective here is that, so in most communist thinking, Marxist thinking, right, the idea is that our situation is entirely dependent on material conditions. Who we are is a result of material conditions, right? Our familial, social, economic context determines who we even are. And those conditions do matter a lot, but it's not, in my view, the totality of who we are, right? This is a materialist philosophy that denies spirituality. It denies selfhood. It denies soul. It denies that we do have choice, that we have some say in creating our lives. And personally, I find that deeply disempowering. It's a little bit like this debate over free will and determinism. Like, the fact that I would behave differently if I assumed there was no free will and I could just kind of sit back and let things happen, that shows that the idea of free will matters. Like, even if freedom is embedded in a deterministic context, our idea of freedom itself has impact and matters. So from a pragmatic perspective, I don't know that it's important to argue over like the metaphysics of freedom when the idea of freedom has an important effect on our lives. Same with spirituality. Like, you could have a very sort of minimal, non-metaphysical idea of soul as simply that which we cultivate through self-reflection, through the arts, through creativity, through reflexivity, through practices, through devotion, etc. Maybe soul is just that, but it's still important, right? Maybe soul simply exists like this in a material frame. Maybe it's not some metaphysical thing. I tend to think it is, but right, for the sake of argument, like the metaphysics of it matters less than the pragmatics of how what we believe affects our lives. Okay, back to manifestation. Is it as simple as visualizing what we want and then sitting back and letting it happen? I mean, it can't be, right? Wouldn't we all be living the lives of our dreams if that were the case, if it were that simple? The individualistic frame that skews this conversation often in a sort of capitalist direction is a sort of root issue, I think, with the way a lot of people relate to this idea. So it's not just the political context, it's the way we think about manifestation itself that tends to be very individualistic, where it's all about what I want. But another feature, I believe, of this transition we're walking through, some of us, is the recognition of our inherent interconnectedness with each other, with the earth, with the more than human world, with all that is. We are individuals, but we're not separate. We're not isolated. And so the reality we experience is a joint manifestation of all humans. But even more than that, like more than humans, right? The earth as well, and all the earth's beings, and all of our guides, and all of reality. So is manifestation real? Yes, but it's not as simple as you create what you in your own mind want. And again, even in a very minimally metaphysical way, we can acknowledge that like everything humans have created, they first imagined, right? So even in a sort of obvious way, we can acknowledge that we have to first intend and imagine and visualize in order to create with intention. And this brings in another important theme, which is that often we create unconsciously. So the unconscious plays a huge role in manifestation. For example, when we unconsciously recreate traumatic situations. I can't remember the name of it, but there's this idea in psychoanalysis that maybe it's repetition compulsion. Let me look it up quick. Yes, okay. I looked it up. It's called repetition compulsion. It's the idea that we often recreate traumatic circumstances or situations that resemble some trauma we've previously experienced in some way, because that's what's familiar. In a way, it's comfortable. It's what we know. And maybe there's a spiritual element to this where perhaps that tendency can help us to better understand the dynamics and that situation to give us an opportunity to heal. I don't know if that's part of psychoanalytic theory, but that's my spiritual sense that sometimes we can, revisit painful dynamics so that they can, come more fully into our conscious awareness so that we can work through them. But that's an example of like unconscious manifestation, right? People aren't usually intending to create trauma. And so if we just have a simplistic view of manifestation of like what I think consciously I create, we're going to be missing out on this whole dimension of the way our unconscious has a hand in what we create. And it's not just trauma. It could be just situations we're used to, we're familiar with. It could be creating based on our assumptions. It could be creating based on our fears, our deeply embedded sense of survival needs. I'm thinking about Pluto here for astrology nerds, right? How Pluto has that hand in creating in our lives. And if you're learning astrology, you could look at where Pluto is in your chart, right? What house, what sign, what aspects, to perhaps gain more insight on this. So the process of manifestation is complicated by our political context, political, economic, social, B, our unconscious, and C, our soul. So the simplistic version of manifestation is rather egoic often. Often it's framed as like whatever your ego desires, a bigger house, a fancier car, that can be yours. But what our ego desires is not always in line with what our soul desires. And it's not that ego is bad. I think there's a place for ego. I think it's actually important. But in a spiritual context, we can work with ego in a way where we work to align it with our soul so that we're not divided within ourselves. And sometimes when manifestation doesn't seem to be working, it may be because on a soul level, what we truly want is not the same as what we think we want on an ego level. So like if you really want that promotion, but on a soul level, right, that deeper part of yourself knows that there's something better for you or something more aligned or something that will allow you to learn and evolve, then that part of you may actually interfere in what your ego is trying to manifest. So I think that practices of learning to collaborate with our soul, with our guides, with our higher self or true self, you could say, are at least as important as like manifestation practices. I think that manifestation practices work a lot better and serve us more when they are paired with practices of collaborating with our soul, our guides, our higher self or true self, with God, with the universe, however you want to frame it. If we are working to find inner alignment and harmony with those vaster aspects of ourselves, then what we create will flow more smoothly. Let's add one more layer here. Now, even all of this doesn't get at all of the nuance around how and what we create. So, one of my teachers, Pilar Lesko, puts it in this way, which I love. She says, your mind doesn't create your reality, your aura does. So if we're trying to create, let's say, a thriving business, but every time we think about money, we have an automatic bodily response of shutting down because of certain past experiences, that's going to come into play. If at a young age we learn to keep ourselves safe by opening up energetically to those around us, to track and read what people close to us were feeling, thinking, intending, so that we could have some control over the situation and maybe avoid their anger, for example, then we will have learned a certain way of operating our aura, right? Where we're consistently leaving our own system to track people around us, which can be exhausting, overwhelming, draining, because we're feeling into and processing all kinds of energies that aren't our own. That's perhaps also another whole conversation we could get back into, this pattern, because I think a lot of us have it. But just as one example, right, of how our aura and energetic system can impact what we're creating, right? Because if you're operating in that way, it'll be a lot harder to feel into actually what you even want, let alone have enough energy and capacity to create it. So I don't think manifestation can be separated from spiritual work, healing work, trauma work, political work, psychological work, emotional work. Like all of this is tied together. So in some ways, this conversation is not one that we can have in just a day, because it's like all of spirituality comes into play, all of politics comes into play, right? It's actually extremely complex and subtle and nuanced how we create what we create. But all that said, what we think, what we believe, what we feel, what we visualize, that does matter. So let's, for now, set aside the never-ending conversation around the complexities of this process and look at manifestation practice. And you might even call this magic. And there are, many traditions and rituals and processes within magic, right? Like traditional ceremonial magic and all the other traditions around that. But at the heart of these, I think there are a few basic features. One is the willingness and intention to collaborate with vaster aspects of ourselves and perhaps guides or other beings, gods, goddesses, etc., to ask for help, basically, to acknowledge that we aren't separate, that we are co-creating with other humans, yes, but also with aspects of ourselves and with non-human beings. And a part of the process is discerning the intention, to sift through what it is you truly desire, and is it aligned with your soul desire? And that takes self-knowledge and self-work and a willingness to notice subtle sensations, like a subtle inner resistance, or that feeling of like something's off here, something's misaligned, there's something to work through, there's something to attend to, right? So first, what do you actually desire? And working in a collaborative way can be a way to come to that desire, that intention, and then to relate to it in a way that's not purely mental, but also emotional, and maybe in two different ways. One is, how do you want to feel? How we want to feel is more important than the outer circumstances we think we want. Is it money you want? Or is it the feeling of being supported, of abundance, of having everything you need and more? That is deeper than money. So what do you really want? Is it some political policy or system, right? Is it some like ideological structure? Or is it the feeling that you hope such a political system would deliver? The feeling and the reality of it. Like, what do we actually want from our political system? Setting aside philosophies, ideologies, big systems, almost setting aside the politics of it. How do we want to feel supported by our social systems? And how do we want other people to feel? And how do we want to feel about that? Do you want a bigger house, or do you want the feeling of spaciousness and a safe place to retreat to and beauty, right? Like, what is it we actually want? I think this is another way that often our manifestation practices can go wrong, right? If we have this simplistic view of just like naming this external thing, like someone who creates a thriving business only to find that they're so overworked and exhausted and anxiety ridden that then they wonder, is this what I really wanted? What have I created here? So what do we actually want? What do you actually want? How do you want to feel? Do you want to not have to work? Or do you want to be able to work on something that is your soul's desire and calling? Do you want to be able to create? Do you want to have freedom and flexibility? I'm not trying to tell you what you should want, right? These are just examples. So A, collaborating with forces vaster than yourself. B, discerning what it is you actually want on a feeling level, on an experiential level. And then a practice of imagining into that, feeling into that, actually cultivating those feelings. That's the practice, is in the moment creating the feelings that will arise from the outer circumstances that we are also hoping to create. There's this sort of circular process here. It's almost like the reverse of the repetition compulsion, where we can like train our system into the way we want to feel in order to make that more likely as a result of outer circumstances as well. And there may be specifics, right? Like if you want a partner, you want a partner. So it's not to say to completely let go of any outer circumstances in the imagining process, but to focus in on how you want to feel with a partner. How do you want it to feel? And can you create that feeling in a small, perhaps, way? And I would suggest, like, sometimes people get very specific in their manifestation practice, right? Like, I want a partner with these qualities and they're going to look like this. Personally, I think that level of specificity can interfere with the creative process. If we're too specific in the outer form we want our creation to take, it can cut us off from possibility. What if the perfect partner is waiting for you, but you know, their hair color is different than what you specified on your list, right? So I think it makes more sense to focus on the feeling, the experience we desire, and to be a little bit more relaxed around the specifics, around the outer form. We can also interfere with this process when we get too concerned with how, or when we prevent ourselves from desiring what we really want because we assume it's not possible. So this is why this is magic, because we are focusing in on the desire, the outcome, the feeling state, without worrying about the how. That does not mean that there are no actions to take. So I'm going to come to that after. So let's set that aside just for a moment. I'm going to come back to taking action, because there's one more really key part of this process, which is the hardest part, I think, which is once we practice cultivating, imagining into the feeling, to release attachment to the outcome. That is effing hard, right? Especially with something we really, really want. And it's also hard because part of the process is the emotional connection to that thing, right? Feeling into how much we desire it and how good it would feel. But a key part of this practice is letting go, trusting, surrendering, releasing. And that's, again, where a connection to something greater than ourselves can be essential in this process. Now, if we do a practice like this, and of course, you know, this can take many different forms. I feel like I'm trying to kind of pare down this practice to sort of the basic structure that I think is required. But it can take many different shapes or forms. Like you could make a vision board. That could be the outer shape of this practice, but, you know, bringing in these sort of more inner qualities into it, I think can be really helpful. Now, after this practice is completed, we may be guided to take specific outer action. So this isn't just, doing some ritual and then sitting back and waiting, right? If you want a job, you may have to make some phone calls. You may have to send out some resumes. If you want a partner, you might have to leave your couch. But I think having this sort of practice or process can help prepare us to be more attuned to what specific actions are aligned. So again, you could see this in a very non-magical, non-metaphysical way, right? As setting an intention and then taking steps to make it happen. Personally, I think there is more going on, but for some people it might be helpful to see that a lot of this is quite practical. Now, of course, this kind of practice can be done on an individual level for what we desire for ourselves in our own lives. And it can be done on the collective level of what we desire for the collective, what we desire for humanity. Now, this can get into some very challenging concepts. If we co-create our reality together, if we're all interconnected, then we are all collaborating with what we see taking place on the world stage. This is a very challenging idea. And, maybe some of you won't accept this, and that's okay. But the idea is, if there is war, then in some maybe very subtle way, we are all participating in that. It doesn't mean it's our fault, right? It doesn't mean that some people aren't more responsible than others. But on a spiritual level, one of the most important things we can do, I believe, is ask ourselves, where am I warring? How am I at war within myself, or with people in my life, or with other parts of myself, right? Do I catch myself fighting in my own mind? So it's not to say we cause war through that, but that one of the biggest impacts we can have, I know not everyone's going to accept this, and that's okay, but I believe from a spiritual perspective, one of the biggest impacts we can have is to be really honest, to look within, to find perhaps even just a trace amount of warring or whatever it is that we see externally that we don't like or want or desire, to see perhaps the most subtle example of that within ourselves and to work with that, on that, through that. If we take seriously the idea that we are all interconnected, there are certain responsibilities that come with that, I think, to really tend to our own inner lives, to recognize that how we think and be matters, not just for ourselves, but for everyone else. And that our spiritual work matters. Our healing work matters. And none of this is to say that it's our fault or we are wrong or we've done badly or anything like that. Because while we've been politically disempowered, we've also been spiritually disempowered. And most of us have been trained out of this way of thinking. And so I think a certain degree of gentleness and forgiveness is helpful, especially as we consider, what we've already created if we're not entirely happy with that, right? It's not to say it's our fault. And I'm hoping that this feels empowering, that this shows us that we have some say in what we create individually and collectively. I'm going to leave it there for today, my loves. Thank you for listening. Till next time. Goodbye. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I want to share with you that I am starting an astrology circle. I'm really excited. It's going to be very fun. It's going to be an astrology circle that goes deeper. So we're going to get together with our own natal charts. I'm going to show you how you can track transits to your chart. If that's all jargon to you, don't worry, because you will get an intro video when you sign up that will show you how you can access your own chart and begin to work with it. So we're going to get together every 2 weeks. We're going to talk about the current astrology and how it applies to each of us individually. So this is really empowering and rich because we get the personal layer of what we're moving through. And it's also a really great way to learn astrology, no matter what level we're at, by paying attention to the current astrology, to our own chart, and to how it's actually playing out in our lives. So we get real-time, real-world examples of how the archetypes are playing out. So, learning astrological theory is great, but it's really only through experience and tracking that with the astrology that we really deepen our understanding of the theory and gain a more practical and embodied understanding of astrology. It is entirely free. If you can't make it live, you'll get a recording. There's a link in the description box to sign up. I hope to see you there. You can support the show by leaving a 5-star review, by sharing it with others, and for as little as $4 a month by clicking the link in the description box. Don't forget to subscribe so that you will receive new episodes when they come out.